Selling a growing business. Today's video, I want to talk about 4 key elements that we focus on when we're selling a business that's experiencing meaningful growth as it's entering the business exit process. And if you stick around to the end, we'll talk about one tip in particular that optimizes the probability of extracting the best terms. So the first variable to consider is the timeline of value. And so what we mean by that is when you're valuing a company, you think of the fundamental valuation tool as a multiple of EBITDA or pre-tax earnings. We're saying, well, what EBITDA are we looking at? Is it this year? Is it last year? Is it the last few years? And so traditionally, private equity would look at the last 3 years averaged. That's kind of a bit of a dated metric. And so in today's environment, it'll be more on TTM is what they'll call it. So trailing 12 months. So it's looking at, if it's June of this year, we'll look at January through June of 2023, as well as July through December of 2022. That's often a way that we will push forward time evaluation. In certain situations, given a particular growth profile of a business, we may get some credit for forward looking beyond that. But what we like to do is try to push up the timeline as much as possible. So we're not looking at last year, we're not looking at an average of the last 3 years, but what is the most current, trailing 12 months. In some situations, you may even get a run rate, if you will, of the current year, but in most situations, TTM is going to be the metric. Secondly is the permanence of growth. We mean this from a qualitative perspective, and then the next variable will be a quantitative perspective. But when we say permanence of growth, why is the business growing? And so if you say, hey, everybody just really wants to eat potato chips this year, well, that's an okay reason. But if you said, hi, we just hired 4 new salespeople that are targeting this many new accounts every day and funneling down this many new wholesale clients for our potato chip company, well, that's a lot more substantial, right? It's not predicated on the whims and fancies of the ultimate consumer, but rather it's just showing that enough inputs, right? Doubling the inputs should double the outputs. And if that is the case and it's defensible, then the permanence from a qualitative perspective of that growth is more believable and will have more veracity. Now, pivoting to the quantitative element, the next variable is the certainty of growth. And so getting back to some of those metrics of outreach, if we looked at the same salespeople and said, okay, every salesperson is making this many calls, this is kind of the pull-through rate relative to calls, into meetings, into proposals, and then ultimately what the percentage of success is. If you can show that over and over and over again, right, the data is indisputable. And so if you show that kind of growth funneling down into EBITDA, into productivity, then again, now you're tackling the quantitative element too. And so right, again, we're getting away from randomness, we're getting away from why does something happen, and we're moving more towards qualitatively defining why this is happening, and then quantitatively showing how the numbers trickle out and why this is defensible on a going forward basis. Lastly, our future catalysts and probabilities. And so in any engagement, we're defining the historical performance of a company and why that's reliable. We're looking at the current growth and what's being implemented and why that is defensible and why it's working the way it should be working and will continue to do so. And then we also want to layer on top of that some of the ongoing catalysts to say, okay, well, when the business hits this mark, we're going to implement this process, we're going to hire these people, we're going to take on these types of customers, whatever it may be. But if you were to then list all of those future catalysts and even put a probability next to each one in terms of timing, in terms of when that's expected to take place, how it's expected to take place, it all builds credibility. And so when selling a growing business, you want to clearly define the timeline for value, right? Let's look at the TTM, let's look at the forward-looking numbers, let's paint a picture that we feel comfortable of. Now let's support that by first looking at the qualitative elements of why is it growing, pivoting to the quantitative elements about what that trickles down to relative to numbers and how that's likely to persist. And then lastly, what are even more catalysts, what are even more growth drivers that can be actuated in the future, and what are the probabilities or timings that we feel comfortable with in that regard. So that takes a very comprehensive view of a growing business, but by virtue of doing that, it boils down to a much more defensible position when negotiating a value. Because anytime you're selling a growing business or even looking for capital for a growing business, the answer is going to be, well, how sure can we be that this is going to happen? If you give them the evidence, then that certainty is considerably higher. And so lastly, the tip that we have that we implement in all of these exercises is spelling out the EBITDA for the future. And so if all of these things are going to happen, then you can't give a potential acquirer a homework assignment of saying, figure out how that all trickles down into the numbers and paints a picture relative to profit and valuation, right? So if we're doing this for a company and we want to say the current EBITDA is $2 million, we believe it's worth 7 times EBITDA, 8 times EBITDA, and then we believe all of these things are going to happen, and here's what the financial statements will look like when they do happen, and it boils down to 4 million or 5 million of EBITDA, and we believe you may be able to get a 10 times multiple at that juncture. Well, if you can show that jump, that leap in enterprise value for a business, then it's much more substantiated first, and then secondly, you are doing a lot of the work for someone who's going to be evaluating the business, and that's valuable to them because it creates a much more understandable pathway and much more definable when they have to discuss it with their board, their investment committee, or whoever it may be on their side. And so that's the thought for today. Selling a growing business, how we pursue it, and one tip to keep in mind. Hope the week's going well. Keep pushing forward. God bless. See you next time.